Hello, friends. I hope that you are safe and well where you are as we continue to practice social distancing. And I thank you for joining again in Old Testament Windows Session 6. Looking forward to the time we can all be back together soon. God bless. Melissa Fleur Bixler, in her book Fire by Night, says these words: "The Old Testament gives us stories of God's life touching down to earth, and we call these moments holy. The Scriptures also hold within them stories of holiness elongated into a sustained encounter with one another. We call that friendship." The Book of Ruth is a book that tells us a story of two women's friendship and how that is sustained through times of adversity and peril. Let's take a look at the book of Ruth and begin with Ruth chapter 1, verses 1 through 17. How would you describe both the character of Ruth and the character of Naomi as you see them in this chapter? Pause the video and take a few moments to think, reflect, or discuss that with someone. The notes in the Wesley Study Bible point out that many of the names in this story have theological significance. Bethlehem, for example, whose inhabitants are starving, means something like house of bread or house of food. The name Elimelech means something like my God is king, and Naomi translates something like sweetness. The study notes also point out that because of the famine in the land, this family finds itself going where it would not otherwise necessarily choose to go. You may be aware that the land of Moab is often negatively portrayed in the Old Testament, but in this book, the book of Ruth, the Moabites are seen actually as generous, sharing their food and intermarrying with the Israelites, demonstrating for us how even ancient enemies can live in peace. What we see here at the beginning of the book of Ruth is two paths that form along a common intimacy of tragedy. Ruth's story centers on two choices. One, a return to biological family, to stability and familiarity. And two, the creation of a home outside of the bonds of kinship. A question for reflection: how many of you have been faced with a decision like that at some point? What influenced your choice? In an astonishingly brief account, the story is set. The husbands of three women, Ruth, her mother-in-law Naomi, and Naomi's other daughter-in-law, Orpah, not to be confused with Oprah, by the way, are picked off by disease one by one. First, Naomi's husband dies. Then, in the course of two verses, told in a very matter-of-fact way, Naomi's two sons disappeared, passed away, gone in a moment like a vapor. With her daughter-in-laws left to fend for themselves as vulnerable widows, Naomi entreats them to return to their homes, to their mothers, and to find new marriages. Orpah, whose name the rabbis explain is a derivative of the verb to return, does just that, returns to her family, returns to the Moabites, presumably to remarry, which would have afforded her some protection. But by contrast, Ruth refuses to leave Naomi. In fact, after twice being advised by Naomi to return to the Moabites, Ruth pleads with her mother-in-law, and we find the heart of that plea in verses 16 and 17. Go back and take another look at those two verses right now. Some of us have probably heard these verses recited at weddings. They are a type of vow, like the promises between partners in marriage. And yet these words are words of friendship between two women holding on to each other. Words binding their lives together, where friendship is survival. Because of that, Ruth is a story that complicates our sense of being at home. Where home happens, between whom home happens, within what boundaries, and how these boundaries are blurred between peoples and borders and families. We actually find some echoes of that in the New Testament as well, where Jesus tells an astonished crowd that his mother and brothers are those who do the will of God, not those who share his biology or household of origin. What do you make of that? I invite you to pause and reflect on both the story of Ruth and Naomi, as well as those words of Jesus in the New Testament, and reflect on that question. What if both in the words that Ruth shares with her mother-in-law Naomi and the words that Jesus shares about his mother and his brothers, if instead of rejection we are meant to hear a call of expansiveness of relationship, opening up our lives to others? Ruth and Naomi and Jesus remind us that the space where God's life occurs is in companionship. Seems very timely with everything that we're going through now in this time of social isolation in many respects. The book of Ruth may also invite us to consider an understanding of the church where we will come in and out of each other's lives, where love grows and extends outward and beyond our biological kinship. I'd invite you, if you have time, to read the rest of the book of Ruth now. It's not terribly long. It's only 4 chapters in total. And you might find it enlightening to read that story. I'm sure you've heard it before, but remind yourself as you read through that. And then we'll have some closing discussion together. So eventually, Ruth and Naomi devise a plan for a more permanent security, working out a plan in which the still eligible Ruth will unite with a distant relative of Naomi's late husband, a man named Boaz. That's in Ruth chapter 4, verses 11 and 12. And in the final chapter of the book, we find Naomi surrounded by a community of women who pronounce a blessing upon her. This passage familiar to you from Philippians 4, chapter 8 in the New Testament. Finally, beloved, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is pleasing, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence and if there's anything worthy of praise, think about these things. As you reflect on the story of Ruth, what things in that story particularly strike you as being true and noble and right and pure and lovely, admirable, excellent, or praiseworthy? One of the things that's intriguing about the book of Ruth is that it's one of the few narratives about Israelite friendship that also concerns a friendship that crosses ethnic lines. The center of this story is 2 women who make deep commitments to each other. As childless widows in foreign lands, they also represent the poorest of the poor. And a primary theme is faithful living with one another, showing the same compassion towards each other that God has for humankind. What emerges from this story is a new kinship, a new belonging, a new covenant love between Naomi and Ruth, a neighborhood of blessing, a type of community where the marginalized are included, the elderly are cared for, children are valued. The story ultimately gives us a window into God's vision of redemption, because everyone in this story is redeemed in one way or another, from emptiness to fullness, from death to life. These windows are symbols of a God who restores and nourishes life and invites us to be part of this holy activity as well. Friends, I hope you've enjoyed this study of Ruth, and I look forward to being with you again in the future. Stay safe, stay well, take care. God bless.